All right, let's jump into a deep dive on a topic you might not expect to be so interesting. Tariffs. We're going to be looking at the history of tariffs in the U.S. through the lens of Abraham Lincoln's surprisingly strong opinions on them.
Yeah, it's the side of him you don't often hear about.
Right, we've got a whole stack of historical articles and excerpts here,
Oh,
so
yeah.
let's get into it.
Sounds good. It's easy to think of tariffs as just like, another dry economic policy, but
Right.
in the early U.S., they were a really central issue.
Okay.
The federal government relied super heavily on tariffs for no income tax back then.
Oh, wow.
So the tariff rate wasn't just some number, it was a huge political battleground.
I see, yeah. So no pressure on whoever set that tariff rate, right? Like, it's like being the one to cut the cake at a birthday party.
Yeah.
Everyone's watching to make sure they get their fair share.
Totally. And just like with cake, different groups wanted different size slices. The North and the South had drastically different views on trade. And that created a huge rift in U.S. politics. It's kind of like an early version of today's global trade tensions, just with hoop skirts and top hats instead of, tweets and tariffs.
I love that analogy.
Mm-hmm.
So what exactly were those North-South differences all about? Was it just a simple, I want lower taxes versus I want to protect my business kind of thing?
It was a little more nuanced than that. So the South, with its cotton-based economy, really relied on exporting to Great Britain. So they saw tariffs on British goods as like, a direct hit to their wallets. Free trade for them meant keeping those cotton profits flowing and preventing what they saw as federal overreach.
Okay, yeah. So basically the South was like, hands off my cotton money, Uncle Sam.
Exactly.
What about the North? What was their perspective?
The North, on the other hand, was right in the middle of a manufacturing boom, and they saw tariffs as essential to protecting their growing industries from being undercut by, cheaper British imports. It was about nurturing homegrown businesses and fostering a strong domestic market.
All right,
Think of
let's
it
jump
like
into a deep dive on a
the
topic
Buy
you might not
American
expect to be
campaigns
so
you see
interesting.
today, but
Tariffs.
obviously with much higher stakes.
We're going to be looking at the history of tariffs in the US
the immediate
through the lens of
but
Abraham
also
Lincoln's
these competing visions
surprisingly
for the future
strong
of the US
opinions on
economy.
them.
Exactly.
I'm guessing
It's the
things
side
got
of him
pretty
you don't
heated.
often hear
Absolutely.
about.
Right. We've got
Actually,
a whole
the tensions
stack
were
of
so
historical
high
articles and excerpts
that in
here, so
1832,
Oh, yeah.
South
Let's get into
Carolina
it.
threatened to
Sounds good.
secede
It's easy
over
to think
a
of
tariff
tariffs as just like,
that they actually
another
called the
dry
tariff
economic
of
policy, but
abomination.
Right.
In the
Tariff of
early U.S.,
abomination.
they
I know,
were a
wild
really
right. Wow.
central This
Okay.
incident, although the it was federal ultimately government resolved, it kind of
super
foreshadowed
heavily on
the
tariffs
sectional
for
tensions that would
no
later
income
lead
tax
to the
back
Civil
then.
War.
Oh, wow.
It's
So the
amazing how
tariff
these
rate wasn't
economic
just some
issues
number,
can
it was
become
a
so politically charged.
Totally.
So where does Lincoln fit into all of this? Was he Team North or Team South when it came to tariffs?
Well, here's where it gets really interesting. From the very beginning of his political career, Lincoln was a really strong supporter of protective tariffs.
Really?
Yeah. In fact, in 1832, the same year as that whole Tariff of Abominations crisis, a 23-year-old Lincoln kicks off his campaign for state legislature by saying, I am in favor of a high protective tariff.
Wow, so young Lincoln was a tariff enthusiast. That's not the image that usually comes to mind.
I know, it's kind of surprising.
What was behind his strong support for tariffs?
Well, this stance aligned him with the American system, a pretty comprehensive economic vision that was championed by Henry Clay. This American system advocated for government investment in infrastructure, a national bank, and of course, protective tariffs to foster domestic industry and economic independence.
So it wasn't just a random pro-tariff stance. It was part of this bigger vision for national development. It almost sounds like a blueprint for modern economic policy.
It really does, doesn't it? You see those echoes in debates about infrastructure spending and protecting American jobs. But, and here's what's even more fascinating, Lincoln's arguments for tariffs went beyond just benefiting factory owners.
Oh,
He argued that tariffs could actually help farmers too.
really? I always thought of tariffs as helping manufacturers, not the people out in the fields. How did he make that connection?
Yeah, that's the common misconception.
Right.
But Lincoln saw the bigger picture. He was arguing that tariffs could actually lead to lower prices for manufactured goods by stimulating domestic competition. Because if American manufacturers don't have to compete with cheaper imports, they can focus on innovating and lowering their prices, which benefits everyone, including farmers who need those manufactured goods.
It's about creating a more vibrant and self-sufficient market within the U.S.
Exactly. He saw the American economy as this interconnected web, arguing that thriving manufacturers would buy more from farmers, pay higher wages to workers, and those workers, in turn, would have more money to spend on, those farm products. It was a win-win, in his view.
Lincoln was really making the case for this kind of economic ripple effect where, Boosting one sector could lift the entire economy.
Exactly.
He didn't just talk about it, right? He actually debated these ideas publicly.
He did, and quite passionately, actually. In 1844, he got into a series of week-long debates on the tariff with John Calhoun, a Democrat, one of the loudest voices for the South.
Wow.
Yeah. Those debates became legendary. People described them as some of the most logical and finest discussions on the subject in the whole state.
Week-long debates on tariffs. That's dedication. They must have been like tariff titans, going head-to-head on all the finer points of economic policy. I can barely stay focused on a Twitter thread for more than 5 minutes.
Right. They were definitely intellectual heavyweights, no doubt. But as the 1850s approached, even for someone as dedicated to the tariff issue as Lincoln, it started to, take a backseat to an even bigger and more urgent crisis. As the nation got more and more consumed by, the debate over slavery, the tariff kind of faded from the forefront. I mean, it was still important, but not the main event anymore. It's a bit like when you have a huge global event that just takes over the news, right? Other big issues get pushed aside, even if they're still simmering under the surface.
Right. It's like trying to talk about, I don't know, climate change during a war, right? The issue doesn't go away, but it's not the top headline. So what happened to the tariff issue? Did it just disappear completely until after the Civil War?
Not quite. It actually had a resurgence leading up to the 1860 election. You see, the Panic of 1857, which was a really bad economic downturn that had global impacts, led to renewed calls for, protectionist policies. And Pennsylvania, which was a crucial swing state in the election, was really divided on the tariff.
So even though slavery was the defining issue of the time, economic anxiety was still a powerful force, and the tariff was a way to tap into that.
Exactly. Lincoln, even though he was personally more focused on stopping slavery from expanding, he still needed Pennsylvania's votes to win the presidency. So he had to walk this tightrope between appealing to the pro-tariff and the anti-tariff folks within the Republican Party.
Sounds like a tough political balancing act. So how did he deal with that? Did he have to compromise on his pro-tariff stance?
There's this great anecdote that shows just how much pressure he was under. He got all these desperate letters from Pennsylvania Republicans begging for any sign that he was still a tariff man.
Like, show us the receipts, Lincoln. Prove you're one of us.
Yeah, some even asked for his old tariff manuscripts, like the ones from his debates with Calhoun. Like, they were saying, we need proof you actually get economics, Abe.
Imagine having to dig through your old college papers to prove you actually paid attention in Econ 101. Talk about pressure.
Lincoln, being the pragmatist that he was, understood how important Pennsylvania was, and he knew that in politics, how things look is often as important as what they actually are.
It shows that even the greatest leaders sometimes have to play the game. But getting elected is one thing. Actually governing is a whole other challenge. How did Lincoln approach the tariff issue once he was in the Oval Office?
Well, he was in a really tough spot. He had this Republican Party with all sorts of different views on tariffs. And on top of that, he had to navigate this growing crisis with the South, like trying to lead an orchestra where everyone's playing a different tune while a storm rages outside.
That's a pretty intense leadership challenge. So how did he try to keep everyone on the same page, or at least playing in the same key?
We actually have some examples of how he handled this. In a speech in Pittsburgh, on his way to his inauguration, he basically walked a tightrope. He acknowledged the different ways people were interpreting the Republican platform on tariffs, but said he'd study it carefully once he was in office.
So he was saying, I hear you, Pennsylvania, but no promises just yet. Classic political move, trying to keep everyone happy without committing to anything specific.
Exactly. But at the same time, he was getting these strong letters from this economist, Henry C. Carey, who was a big advocate for protectionism.
Yeah.
Carey was basically telling Lincoln, Mr. President, tariffs are the answer. Don't overthink this.
I just do it.
Pretty much. But here's where history takes a funny turn. The South, the ones who had always hated tariffs, well, they seceded. And that actually cleared the way for the moral tariff, which was super protectionist, to get passed.
Wait, so the South leaving made it easier to pass a high tariff? That's a wild twist. Talk about unintended consequences.
It really is. It shows how historical events can have these crazy ripple effects. And this all happened right before Lincoln took office. So suddenly, the tariff wasn't just a debate anymore. It was a reality he had to deal with.
It's fascinating how Lincoln's presidency shows the connections between economic policy, political maneuvering, and just plain historical events. You can't understand one without the others.
Exactly. History's not just a straight line, it's a web of all these intricate forces that often have really unpredictable results.
Yeah, it's like they say, follow the money, right? understanding the economic side of things can explain a lot about why people and even whole countries do what they do.
Totally. And just like back in Lincoln's day, all these debates about trade and economic policy, they're still shaping the world today.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Just look at the headlines: trade wars, globalization, tariffs. These are still hot-button issues that affect everyone.
Exactly. And as you come across those discussions, it's really important to think about, the historical context, the different viewpoints at play.
Right.
And remember how economic decisions often have these ripple effects. They go way beyond the immediate issue.
It's like a call to be informed, to be engaged citizens, not just passively scrolling through headlines.
Exactly.
We got to think critically about these arguments, like Lincoln did, weighing the pros and cons of different economic policies.
Yeah, sure.
Speaking of which, Lincoln's presidency brings up some questions about, the long-term impact of that very protectionist moral tariff he signed into law.
Right.
So, what were some of the lasting effects of that policy? Did it actually help build a stronger American economy like Lincoln and his supporters believed?
Well, that moral tariff passed right before the Civil War. It was a big turning point in U.S. economic history.
Okay.
It basically started this whole era of high tariffs that went on for decades, well into the 20th century.
So it wasn't just a temporary thing during the war. It really set the course for the country's economic future.
Yeah, exactly. And those high tariffs, they did play a role in, the North industrializing so quickly during and after the Civil War. They gave American industries some breathing room to grow and compete globally, kind of like what some countries try to do with tariffs today.
But I imagine there were trade-offs, right? Like with any economic policy, there's always that debate: protect domestic industries or embrace free trade. Both sides have their supporters and their critics.
Yeah, absolutely. Some people argue that those high tariffs, while they help some industries, also led to higher prices for consumers. If you don't have competition, you don't really have to innovate or lower your prices. And then there were industries that needed imported raw materials. They were hurt by the higher costs.
So it's complicated. No easy answers. Kind of like the debates we have today about globalization and trade deals.
Yeah, totally. It's important to understand, the nuances and how different parts of the economy are affected.
Right.
That's what makes studying history so valuable, I think. It's like this lens to look at current issues, to maybe make better decisions.
I like that.
If we understand how past economic policies worked or didn't work, it can help us deal with the complexities of today's globalized world.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Lincoln and tariffs, what's the main takeaway for our listeners? Why should they care about this, seemingly obscure economic issue from way back then?
Well, I think the main point is that Lincoln's support for those protective tariffs, even when it was politically risky, shows how committed he was to, economic development and the well-being of American workers, especially farmers.
He saw tariffs as a way to make the nation stronger and more prosperous, not just to protect a few wealthy industrialists.
Exactly. And tariffs, even though they seem like a dry topic, they were really mixed up with all those political and regional tensions that led to the Civil War.
Right.
It's a reminder that economic choices have big social and political consequences. They can really shape history.
It's a great reminder that history is more than just memorizing names and dates. It's about understanding the forces that shaped our world, and so often those forces are economic.
Exactly. And just as Lincoln wrestled with those complex tariff issues, we face our own set of economic challenges today. By understanding the past, we can gain valuable insights to help us navigate the present and, who knows, maybe even create a better future.
That's a great way to put it. So as you go about your day, think about Lincoln and his maybe unexpected passion for tariffs. And the next time you hear about a trade war or a new economic policy, take a moment to consider the different perspectives, the historical context, and the potential long-term consequences.
Yeah, who knows? Maybe you'll even become a bit of a tariff enthusiast.
Or at least a more informed and engaged citizen, which is what the deep dive is all about. Thanks for joining us on this exploration of Lincoln and the fascinating world of tariffs.